I always felt that I am the way that I am because of my childhood. And I felt like before I knew about typology and functions, I felt, of course, hey, I'm a very introverted person. Now, I wasn't using the terminology of introversion, but I'm a very quiet person. I'm very calm. I am somebody who is very aware of the emotional vibe of the people around me. I tend to be very slow to put myself into a group. I tend to want to sit back and analyze and watch people. And now I'll say something, and I think if you've had a certain kind of childhood, you'll understand what I'm about to say. And that is that I felt like I grew up being aware of people, so tuned into the emotional vibe of people, because I grew up waiting for something to happen. And it can happen at a moment's notice for no reason. And so I was very highly aware and watching for that shift. Like I said, if you had this kind of childhood, you know what I'm talking about. And you can't help but grow up and be looking for that, being aware, highly aware, waiting for that shift to suddenly happen in somebody. And so I felt, hey, I'm introverted. I'm very highly aware of people. I tend to be very cautious about who I let in or before I really allow myself to be myself with people. And I always felt that was something that I brought forward from my childhood that just kind of had stuck with me. And that's why it was such a revelation whenever I came across, and it was actually by accident, I came across this whole INFJ thing and typology and cognitive functions completely by accident. And maybe I'll tell that story another time. But when I found it and I learned more about it, I was amazed because the INFJ and the cognitive functions, everything, it was amazing to me because it said exactly who I am. It said exactly how I think. And that's why right away, I didn't know anything about typology, but I was like, I don't know what this is, but this is true. How could it know exactly how I think? And the thing is that it made me realize something. And so here's the two things that I want to say about this and my thoughts on, is an INFJ created? And I'll give you two reasons why I think that the answer is no. And the first reason is because everything about the INFJ, everything about how they think and how that kind of forms who they are later in life and their thought processes and how they interact with people. Basically, reading about the INFJ cognitive functions and personality type, I had to think for a moment, wait a minute, so are you saying that it wasn't necessarily my upbringing? I was always going to be like this. I was always going to be somebody who's very highly aware of the emotional vibe of people around me. I was always going to be somebody who analyzed people. And again, I thought that was from my childhood. Hey, I want to make sure that I have a good vibe with people, that I feel people are safe, that I feel that the environment's safe, that I'm highly aware of people who are not in a good emotional space because of what I've been through. And so that stands out to me. But again, you go and you learn about the INFJ and you go, wait a minute, I was always going to be like this. Whether or not I had a certain kind of childhood didn't necessarily play into my cognitive functions and how I think. And I know what you're probably saying. You're saying, well, hold on, you were like this because you were created. And the second reason behind why I'm saying that's not the case is because there are people who had that kind of childhood, who grew up, and yes, they are INFJs, but there are also people who grew up like that who had brothers and sisters who also went through the same kind of situation or the same traumas that they did, and they are different types. They were the ESFP who have an INFJ sibling, but they went through the same thing. There are people who had families, siblings who grew up and none of them are INFJs, yet they all went through a similar kind of childhood. And here's the thing is there are some people who are INFJs who had a much easier life than I had. And there are people who are INFJs who had a much worse life than I had. And there are people who are ESFPs who had a much worse life than I had. And the only thing that is truly different is how we process those situations that we were in. But I really truly believe that it is not something that creates a certain kind of cognitive function. And Carl Jung talked about this as well and said the same thing, that actually it might be even worse for certain types. So let's say that I was, and just to give a random scenario, let's say that I was locked in my room for days on end. And yeah, sure, you go, okay, well, maybe that's traumatic, but what about an ESFP who was locked in their room for days on end? And that's the thing that Carl Jung is talking about, is things, situations that people were put into that are counter to their type. So it's one thing for somebody who is already kind of severely introverted to be kept away, to be told, you know, go to your room, you're stuck in there because you don't want to come out because something bad might happen. It's one thing for an introvert, and I'm not saying that that's not traumatic, but it's another layer to do that to an extrovert, because that is not their natural state to be without that external stimuli. So in a way it can be worse for certain types, even though they went through the same exact thing. And I think we process things differently. And the reason I think maybe INFJs will sometimes feel like this created them is because I do think that INFJs will certainly internalize things very, very deeply when those occasions come up or have happened in their childhood. And I think trying to understand the meaning behind it when there is sometimes no meaning behind the situations they were in or the violence that they experienced. I think they're trying to process this meaning and it sticks with them, and they're processing that and they're stuck in it and they stay in it. And I think there can be this sense of that's what created me in this kind of locked inside this headspace, constantly trying to understand the meaning of things and being lost in it. And I think that can be very trying, but I don't want to take away from the experiences and the trauma that other types experience as well, but they view it differently, they experience it differently, and they'll process it differently. So again, I want to use the ESFP. So maybe they went through the same thing, and they had their own experience, their own way of processing it. And you say, yeah, but you know, maybe they weren't going through trying to understand the meaning of it and stuck in there, which is unfair to the ESFP and what they experienced. Because yes, maybe they experienced it in a different way, but maybe it's not till later in life that they start really, that processing has been happening in the background. It did affect them, And later in life, they might need to, say, go to therapy and say, I need to kind of help understand this processing in the background that has affected me and affected the way I led my life. And maybe for them, again, with their type, they felt, oh, because of the trauma that I went through, I never wanted to sit there and try to focus on those things. And I always did all these other things. And I was always looking for something else outside of myself. I never wanted to sit and process, and they might say that's because of what I went through, which again would be incorrect. That's not what made them an ESFP. They were always an ESFP. They didn't want to sit and focus and process, and it's taken them a long time to get to that point, later in life, and say, I really want to work through some of those things. I think it's affected me. And yes, that's true. But that's not the reason that they were avoiding that inferior NI. That was just simply their type. In the end, we all are individuals. We all had to process that in our own way. And I don't believe that you are created. I actually think it is the opposite. I talk about that in the Changing Type video. And Carl Jung believed that you were most likely born a certain type, and yes, you could experience things that were counter to your type that caused you certain traumas that you had to work through later in life to get back into your natural state. But I don't believe that a type is created. And I don't believe that INFJs specifically are created from trauma, and I think that would be unfair to the other types and the traumas that they've gone through and that they're dealing with and that they have to process in their own way. So that's my reasoning for it. And all I want to say is, for those of you who have gone through your own traumas, I'm very sorry that you went through that. And I hope that you realize it wasn't your fault. And I hope that you have brought that forward in how you treat other people around you. That's all I wanted to say on the subject. Thanks for stopping by.